They towed my truck at 6:12 a.m. while the engine was still warm and the disabled veteran placard was hanging from the mirror, bright blue against the windshield like a warning they chose to ignore. And by the time I stepped onto the porch in my socks with coffee still burning my hand, all that was left was a dark oil stain and the sickening understanding that this was not a mistake, it was a decision. I had parked in the same spot for 14 months, the only place close enough that my damaged knee could handle on bad mornings, the same place the HOA approved in writing after my deployment injury paperwork was submitted, the same place their own board member told me was fine as long as the placard stayed visible, which it always did. The tow notice taped to my door cited unauthorized vehicle storage and community aesthetics, two phrases so vague they felt intentional, as if someone had searched for the most insulting way to erase my disability without saying the word. Before the sun was fully up, my phone was already buzzing with emails from neighbors who had seen it happen, who had watched the tow driver hook up my truck and pause when he noticed the veteran plate, who had seen the HOA president standing there with her arms crossed, nodding anyway. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about parking or rules or aesthetics. This was about power and someone testing how far they could push it. The truck wasn't just transportation, it was the modified vehicle the VA helped me retrofit after my second surgery, the one with the hand controls, reinforced step rail, and adaptive braking that allowed me to work again instead of living on benefits. Without it, I couldn't get to physical therapy, couldn't get to my job at the civil engineering firm downtown, couldn't even do basic errands without pain flaring so badly it dropped me back into the fog I thought I had left overseas. The HOA knew all of that. They had my medical documentation, my accommodation request, and the approval letter signed by the same president who now claimed she had no recollection of any of it. By noon, I had already missed a medical appointment and received a warning email from work asking why I hadn't shown up for a site inspection I was leading. It took exactly 6 hours for a single tow to start dismantling the life I had rebuilt piece by piece. When I went to retrieve the truck, the situation got worse. The impound lot charged a daily storage fee that increased every 12 hours, a release fee for specialized vehicles, and an administrative surcharge that nearly matched my monthly HOA dues. The clerk handed me a damage report noting scraping under the chassis and stress fractures near the adaptive control mount, damage that hadn't been there the day before. The tow company claimed they were acting under HOA authority and refused responsibility. The HOA claimed the tow company was an independent contractor and refused responsibility. Both of them told me to take it up with the other, and both of them knew exactly how expensive and exhausting that process would be. By the time I got the truck back, my hands were shaking with the familiar mix of anger and helplessness that I remembered too well, the feeling of being trapped by a system designed to wear you down quietly. Over the next week, the pattern revealed itself. A violation notice appeared in my HOA portal accusing me of repeated noncompliance, something provably false. A second notice followed for displaying unauthorized signage referring to the veteran decal on my rear window that had been there since the day I moved in. Then came the fines, escalating automatically, compounding daily, each one triggering late fees before I even had time to respond. I requested a hearing and was scheduled 3 weeks out, long enough for the fines to reach a number that felt deliberately intimidating. Neighbors started acting strange. Some avoided eye contact, others quietly asked what I had done to anger the board. A rumor circulated that I was abusing veteran privileges, gaming the system, demanding special treatment. None of it was true, but lies don't need truth to travel fast in a community managed by people who control the notices, the emails, and the narrative. By the time my hearing date arrived, I already knew I wasn't going to attend. The HOA hearing was irrelevant. They had no authority to undo what they had done, and more importantly, they had already crossed into territory they didn't understand. Private associations are powerful, but only inside the lines they are given, and the moment they interfere with federally protected accommodations using expired municipal authority, the balance shifts violently. The day before the hearing, I submitted a single packet, not to the HOA, but to the city's compliance office, the Disability Access Coordinator, and the Municipal Towing Oversight Division. It contained no accusations, no emotional language, no threats. Just timelines, documents, photos, and citations. When the city acknowledged receipt, the automated reply included a case number and a note that enforcement actions, if warranted, could take several weeks. That was fine. I had already waited longer than that to walk without pain. I could wait a little longer to let the system do what it does best when someone finally hands it the right evidence. The city moved faster than I expected. Not loudly or publicly, but with the kind of quiet precision that only happens when a file lands on the right desk already organized. Within 10 days, inspectors were on site walking the community with tablets in hand, photographing signage, measuring curb markings, and checking posted notices against municipal requirements the HOA had ignored for years. I watched from my porch as they stopped at the exact spot where my truck had been parked. The same faded asphalt patch still visible, the same lack of posted restrictions, the same absence of city authorization that should have been there if towing was even remotely legal. No one from the board came out to greet them. The president's SUV stayed in the garage. The compliance officers didn't ask questions loudly, didn't knock on doors, didn't announce anything. They just documented, nodded, and left. That silence unnerved the HOA far more than confrontation would have. The violation notices stopped abruptly, the fines froze without explanation, the scheduled hearing vanished from the portal calendar without comment. Instead, a new email appeared, reminding residents to keep communications respectful and to direct all inquiries through proper channels. That kind of message only shows up when someone realizes they are no longer in control of the timeline. Meanwhile, my life was still stalled. The truck damage had worsened, the adaptive braking responding inconsistently due to stress fractures the impound lot denied responsibility for. The VA repair estimate came back higher than I expected, and my insurance flagged the claim as contested pending liability determination. Work granted me temporary remote accommodations, but field assignments were reassigned, a quiet professional demotion that carried consequences no one said out loud. As the second week passed, information started surfacing in ways that felt almost accidental. A neighbor mentioned a notice posted briefly on the clubhouse door and removed the same afternoon. Another forwarded an email sent an error to the wrong distribution list referencing a city inquiry and advising board members not to respond individually. The tow company's number stopped answering when I called. Then, on a Thursday morning, an official city envelope arrived addressed not to me, but to the HOA, mistakenly delivered to my mailbox. It listed preliminary findings regarding unauthorized towing activity, failure to comply with disability accommodation ordinances, and improper delegation of enforcement authority. The potential penalties outlined weren't small. They were calculated per violation, per day, retroactive. I returned the envelope unopened to the correct address and documented the delivery, but the damage was already done. The HOA knew the city had teeth, and more importantly, they knew someone had shown the city exactly where to bite. Panic changes behavior quickly. The president suddenly requested a meeting through an attorney, framing it as a misunderstanding and offering to waive all fines if I would agree to release claims. The tone was different now, careful, legalistic, stripped of the confidence that comes from assuming no one will push back. I didn't respond. There was nothing to negotiate. This wasn't about my fines anymore, and it hadn't been for a while. The inspectors came back a second time, this time with representatives from the city's Disability Access Office. They reviewed my accommodation approval, compared it to the HOA's enforcement actions, and photographed the truck damage themselves. They asked for maintenance records from the tow company and were told they couldn't be located. They requested the HOA's towing authorization permits and received expired copies. They requested board meeting minutes approving enforcement changes and were given incomplete records with missing votes. Every gap mattered. In systems like this, absence is evidence. When the rules require documentation and none exists, the assumption isn't innocence, it's negligence. By the third week, the story had shifted beyond me. A notice went out to all residents informing them that the city was reviewing HOA compliance with municipal codes and that certain enforcement activities were suspended pending review. The warning was neutral, but the effect was immediate. Neighbors started comparing notes. One resident realized her car had been towed under similar circumstances months earlier. Another admitted he'd paid fines he never fully understood because he couldn't afford to fight them. A couple down the street mentioned accessibility issues they'd quietly endured without filing formal complaints. What had been isolated incidents began forming a pattern, and patterns are what regulators look for when determining whether a fine is corrective or punitive. The inspectors came back a second time, this time with representatives from the city's Disability Access Office. They reviewed my accommodation approval, compared it to the HOA's enforcement actions, and photographed the truck damage themselves. They asked for maintenance records from the tow company and were told they couldn't be located. They requested the HOA's towing authorization permits and received expired copies. They requested board meeting minutes approving enforcement changes and were given incomplete records with missing votes. Every gap mattered. In systems like this, absence is evidence. When the rules require documentation and none exists, the assumption isn't innocence, it's negligence. By the third week, the story had shifted beyond me. A notice went out to all residents informing them that the city was reviewing HOA compliance with municipal codes and that certain enforcement activities were suspended pending review. The warning was neutral, but the effect was immediate. Neighbors started comparing notes. One resident realized her car had been towed under similar circumstances months earlier. Another admitted he'd paid fines he never fully understood because he couldn't afford to fight them. A couple down the street mentioned accessibility issues they'd quietly endured without filing formal complaints. What had been isolated incidents began forming a pattern, and patterns are what regulators look for when determining whether a fine is corrective or punitive. The fine notice arrived on a Monday afternoon, addressed to the HOA, copied to multiple departments, and summarized in a public city council agenda packet for the following week. The total amount was larger than I expected, calculated across multiple violations, multiple vehicles, and multiple years. Unauthorized towing, failure to comply with disability accommodations, improper enforcement authority, and administrative non-compliance all carried separate penalties. The number wasn't symbolic, it was corrective, designed to change behavior permanently. The city didn't fine them because of my truck. They fined them because my truck exposed a system that had been quietly violating the law for years. Only after the fine became public did the HOA reach out again, this time without lawyers, without conditions, without posturing. They offered reimbursement for my towing fees, repair costs, and lost wages. They offered to publicly acknowledge the error. They offered to update policies and training. I accepted the reimbursement because it covered real harm, but the rest no longer mattered. The city oversight would ensure changes far more effectively than any apology could. The truck was repaired properly under supervised procedures. My work assignments were restored. The placard still hangs from the mirror, visible as ever, but now it doesn't feel like a target.
What surprised me most wasn't that the city fined them. It was how quickly power shifted once the right evidence was placed in the right hands. The HOA had relied on silence, fatigue, and the assumption that individuals would always be easier to pressure than institutions. They were right most of the time. They just picked the wrong person to test it on, and they did it in a way that left a trail no system could ignore. The twist didn't come as relief or celebration, but as retaliation disguised as reform. 2 days after the city fine hit the public agenda, the HOA announced a special assessment to cover unexpected regulatory expenses, carefully worded to spread the cost across every homeowner, including me. It was framed as a shared burden, a necessary adjustment, an unfortunate consequence of outside interference. What they didn't anticipate was how quickly that move would fracture whatever authority they had left. Residents who had never questioned a notice or paid a fine without complaint suddenly realized they were being asked to bankroll the consequences of illegal enforcement they never approved. The assessment notice triggered a wave of record requests, refund demands, and resignations from volunteer committees that had quietly kept the HOA functioning. The board attempted to pause the assessment hours later, but the damage was done. Once people see the money trail, loyalty evaporates. That same week, my insurance carrier finalized liability. The tow company was dropped from consideration entirely after failing to produce compliance certifications and maintenance logs, leaving the HOA as the sole responsible party. The reimbursement I accepted was reclassified as a partial settlement tied to a municipal enforcement action, which carried reporting obligations the board could not avoid. That classification triggered another consequence they hadn't foreseen: mandatory disclosure to lenders. Mortgage servicers received notices that the association was under regulatory review with outstanding penalties and compliance requirements. Refinances stalled. A pending bulk sale collapsed. Suddenly, the HOA's problems were no longer internal. They were financial, reputational, and contagious.
The next twist came quietly, buried in a routine city council pocket that few residents read. The Disability Access Office referred the case to the city attorney for review of potential civil enforcement beyond fines, citing evidence of a pattern affecting multiple residents. Pattern is the word that changes everything. Individual mistakes can be corrected. Patterns invite remedies. Remedies invite oversight. Oversight invites discovery. Within days, the city requested additional records from the HOA, including correspondence, enforcement metrics, and contractor communications spanning several years. The request was not optional, and it carried deadlines that mattered. Board members who had once hidden behind vague authority now faced personal exposure for decisions made without documentation. As pressure mounted, information surfaced from an unexpected direction. A former board member contacted the city directly, providing archived emails and drafts that never made it into official minutes. They showed deliberate strategy discussions about increasing towing revenue, targeting problem vehicles, and avoiding accommodations that complicated enforcement. None of it mentioned veterans or disabilities explicitly, but the language was clear enough to anyone trained to read it. Operational efficiency was prioritized over compliance. Risk was calculated based on the assumption that most residents would pay and move on. That assumption had worked until it didn't. The HOA attempted a reset, calling for new elections and proposing amended bylaws that mirrored city code almost word for word. It was too late for optics. The city doesn't reward mimicry after violations. Compliance is expected, not celebrated. Meanwhile, the assessment was formally withdrawn, replaced by a line-item loan approved in a closed meeting to cover penalties and legal costs. That loan required lender approval, which required disclosure, which required transparency. Each step peeled back another layer of the association's operations, exposing shortcuts that had accumulated quietly over time. Then came the personal twist I hadn't anticipated. The city's findings triggered a review by the state's Consumer Protection Office, not because of my case, but because of the financial disclosures tied to the HOA's governance. The question wasn't just about towing anymore. It was about whether residents had been misled about how enforcement revenue was generated and spent. Auditors requested bank statements, contractor invoices, and reserve fund transfers. The review uncovered irregularities that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a culture of operating just beyond scrutiny. When enforcement revenue is treated as a budget line instead of a corrective tool, the math eventually tells on you. As all of this unfolded, the narrative around me shifted again. The rumor that I had abused accommodations collapsed under documentation. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact began asking how they could file their own complaints. Not out of revenge, but out of exhaustion. They wanted rules that made sense and enforcement that didn't feel arbitrary. The same system that had once isolated individuals now connected them. Shared experience replaced whispered suspicion. The HOA's authority had relied on fragmentation. The city's intervention forced consolidation. The final twist of the section arrived in the form of a notice posted on the community bulletin board and mailed to every resident. It informed them that the city would be appointing a compliance monitor to oversee HOA enforcement practices for a defined period, funded by the association as part of the penalty structure. This wasn't a takeover, but it was close enough to feel like one. The monitor's role was explicit: review enforcement actions, ensure accommodations were honored, and report directly to the city. Autonomy, the thing the HOA prized above all else, was now conditional. The final twist of the section arrived in the form of a notice posted on the community bulletin board and mailed to every resident. It informed them that the city would be appointing a compliance monitor to oversee HOA enforcement practices for a defined period, funded by the association as part of the penalty structure. This wasn't a takeover, but it was close enough to feel like one. The monitor's role was explicit: review enforcement actions, ensure accommodations were honored, and report directly to the city. Autonomy, the thing the HOA prized above all else, was now conditional. For me, the impact was subtle but profound. The truck stayed parked where it had always been, untouched, unchallenged, no notices taped to the door. The placard no longer drew looks. My work stabilized. My medical appointments resumed without disruption. But the real change wasn't personal convenience. It was watching a system recalibrate in real time, not because someone yelled or sued immediately, but because evidence made denial impossible. The HOA had to live with the oversight they invited through overreach. The city didn't fine them out of spite. It fined them to force a reset that would outlast any individual resident. What began as a tow meant to assert control ended with an association answering to the very regulations it had treated as optional. The truck had been the trigger, not the target. The twist wasn't that the city fined them. The twist was that the fine was only the beginning, and everything that followed was the predictable consequence of power applied without understanding the limits that make it legitimate. By the time the compliance monitor's first report was circulated, the HOA barely resembled the organization that had ordered my truck towed with such confidence months earlier. The language was clinical and restrained, but devastating in its clarity. It outlined repeated failures to follow municipal towing procedures, inconsistent enforcement of parking rules, inadequate training on disability accommodations, and a documented reliance on enforcement revenue that blurred the line between governance and profit. It didn't accuse anyone of malice. It didn't need to. Systems don't require bad intentions to cause harm. They only require unchecked authority and the assumption that no one will challenge it. The report recommended mandatory training for all current and future board members, revised enforcement protocols subject to city approval, and a resident appeals process independent of the board. It also required quarterly reporting for 2 years, with penalties escalating automatically if benchmarks weren't met. In other words, the city didn't just punish the HOA, it rewired it. The cost of the fine was significant, but the cost of ongoing oversight was higher, both financially and psychologically. Every decision would now be made knowing someone outside the neighborhood was watching. The president resigned the week after the report was released, citing personal reasons and a desire to move on. 2 other board members followed quietly. The remaining members stayed, not out of loyalty, but because someone had to keep the lights on while the association transitioned. New elections were scheduled, this time supervised by a third-party management firm approved by the city. Attendance was higher than it had ever been. People who had never cared about bylaws or votes suddenly understood how much those details mattered when they went wrong. For me, the end didn't come with a dramatic apology or public vindication. It came in small, almost mundane ways. The compliance monitor emailed me directly to confirm my accommodation was properly recorded under the new system. The city closed my case with a formal notice stating that corrective action had been taken and that no further individual remedies were required. My insurance finalized the claim without appeal. Work sent me back into the field full-time. Life resumed, not triumphantly, but steadily, which is often the real victory. What lingered was the shift in how people interacted with the HOA itself. Notices became clearer.
enforcement slowed and became more deliberate. When a car was cited, the reason was specific and the process transparent. Accommodations were handled quietly and without suspicion. The fear that had once hovered around any interaction with the board dissipated, replaced by something less dramatic but more durable: predictability. Communities don't need power flexes to function. They need rules people trust.
I was asked more than once whether it was worth it, whether the stress and disruption justified the outcome. The question always came from a place of caution, not criticism. People have been trained to see conflict with institutions as dangerous, something to avoid unless absolutely necessary. I never answered with numbers or legal arguments. I answered with the same thing every time. It was worth it because it stopped happening to the next person. It was worth it because silence had been part of the problem and documentation had been the solution. The truck still carries its scars if you know where to look. The repaired sections don't quite match the original finish, a reminder of what happens when equipment designed for accessibility is treated like an inconvenience. I don't mind the reminder. It keeps the story grounded. This wasn't about winning an argument or embarrassing an HOA. It was about drawing a line where one had been quietly erased and forcing the people on the other side of it to acknowledge it existed. Months later, property values stabilized. The special loan was refinanced under better terms after the compliance monitor certified substantial progress. The association's reputation recovered slowly, not because people forgot what happened, but because they saw it change. That distinction matters. Forgetting invites repetition. Remembering with correction builds resilience. The city eventually reduced oversight frequency, signaling confidence in the new structure. The HOA didn't celebrate. It simply adjusted, which was the point all along. I never asked the city to fine them. I asked the city to look. The fine was what happened when looking revealed more than anyone expected. That's the part people often miss. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about exposure. Once a system is exposed to the standards it claims to uphold, it either adopts or collapses. This one adopted, reluctantly, expensively, but permanently. Every morning when I start the truck and ease into the driver's seat, the placard still hangs there, no longer a symbol of vulnerability, but of protection. Not because it shields me from inconvenience, but because it represents a boundary the law recognizes whether or not individuals respect it. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way. The city reinforced it, and I carried on. Not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even small acts of overreach can trigger consequences when someone is willing to slow down, document carefully, and let the right systems do their work. The tow is meant to remind me of my place. Instead, it reminded an entire community of theirs.